The words however and but have almost identical definitions. They are both used to contrast two ideas. But is a simple conjunction, similar to the word and. You can watch my lesson on conjunctions to learn more about how we use them. But essentially, we need a comma when the but is joining two independent clauses that could exist as their own sentences. I like dogs, but I don't like cats. When the contrast is not between two sentences, we don't use a comma with the conjunction. The word however behaves much differently, and how we place this connector word between sentences is the topic of this lesson. However is often still classified as a conjunction, but for our purposes, we'll think of it as a complicated connector. There are lots of punctuation rules that make it much harder to master than the simple conjunction but. Let's take a look at the most important rules. First, remember that these connectors are not simple conjunctions. We're mostly talking about the transition words that you'd see in the transition-focused questions on the SAT. Besides, however, some common examples that can cross into these grammar questions are though, rather, and then. But this is not a complete list. In order to use these connectors, we need two complete sentences that could stand alone. We also need a strong punctuation mark to connect those two sentences. The SAT will usually give us periods and semicolons, but colons and dashes are possible as well. The connector word also requires at least one weak punctuation mark to connect it to one of the sentences. We will usually have either one or two commas surrounding the connector word. There are some exceptions to these rules, but they are very unlikely to appear on an SAT. Notice that this example doesn't include two sentences, and however isn't being used to make a contrast. If an exception like this came up, it would be obvious, so you shouldn't worry about it. Let's focus on the most common connector, however, as we look at some examples. All three of these examples have the exact same meaning. We can see that we have two independent clauses that could exist as separate sentences. First, I'm tired, and second, I can't sleep. To separate these two independent clauses, we need some sort of strong punctuation mark. Then the however is connected to the second sentence with a comma. The first example is probably how you would write these sentences, literally as two separate sentences with a period in between. But remember that a semicolon is the exact same thing as a period, so the second example is basically the exact same thing as the first example. The third example shows us why however is more complicated than the word but. Connectors like however can float around a sentence. They don't have to be placed at the transition point between the sentences. We can really see this property in action with some longer sentences. Not only can however begin a sentence, but it can also end one. Or it can even interrupt a sentence, using two commas instead of one to show the interruption. In all three cases, the meaning is the same. The second sentence is meant to contrast with the first. In other words, we're saying I'm tired, but I can't sleep until my homework is done. Though the word but would never be able to float around like this. It seems strange to put the contrast word at the very end of the contrasting sentence, like in example 2. I agree that this is a weird way to write that could easily confuse your reader, but it is still grammatically correct. No matter where we put the however, it is always contrasting with the sentence before the sentence that the however is in. Let's see a longer example of how this works. This is just one example composed of 3 sentences, or technically, because of the colon after however, it's actually 2 sentences because 2 and 3 are joined by the colon. Still, I think it's better to pretend that each independent clause is its own sentence so that we can see the contrast more clearly. We're still contrasting the idea that I'm tired in sentence 1 with the fact that I can't sleep in sentence 2, even though the however appears to be in between sentences 2 and 3. But notice that contrasting sentences 2 and 3 wouldn't make much sense. They seem to support each other. Both sentences explain why I can't sleep. In fact, the colon is perfectly setting up sentence 3 as a way to give more information about sentence 2. It's worth pointing out that it's unlikely that the however will come after a colon, since colons are typically used to add on supporting information, not to contrast with a previous idea. When you answer connector placement questions on the SAT, you'll need to think about which sentences you're trying to contrast. Remember that no matter where the however floats in a sentence, it always contrasts with the previous sentence. Let's try an SAT-style example. Ebenezer Diabowitz, the famous early jazz pianist, is widely credited as the inventor of the syncopated G chord, as he was the first to be documented playing it in 1927. His contributions to the promotion of jazz music were more consequential. However, in 1929, Diabowitz opened a prominent jazz club in Berlin, helping to establish jazz music as a global phenomenon. When I look at the answer choices, I don't even worry about the however at first. Instead, I notice that I'm offered a semicolon in choices B and C, which means that my first priority is checking if I have 2 independent clauses that could be their own complete sentences. I definitely do. His contributions to the promotion of jazz music were more consequential, and getting rid of some extra clauses, Diabowitz opened a prominent jazz club in Berlin. This immediately lets me cross out choices A and D because the commas are too weak to join the independent clauses. Now I can turn my attention to the connector placement rule. We need to look at the entire passage and notice that there are actually 3 independent sentences in this question. 1, 2, 3. And the semicolon in choices B and C puts the however in different places. Choice B puts the connector in sentence 3, and choice C puts it in sentence 2. Read each set of contrasting sentences to see if the contrast makes sense. You can also use the word but to help you, as long as you place it between the 2 sentences. For choice B, we'd be looking at sentences 2 and 3, which say, his promotion of jazz was more consequential, but he opened a club that helped spread jazz. That doesn't seem like a contrast. Both of those sentences seem to be about how Diabowitz promoted jazz music. Choice C makes more sense as we summarize sentences 1 and 2. He is known as the inventor of this chord, but his promotion of jazz was more consequential. Basically, he's known for one thing, but he should be known for something else. Choice C is the answer. Notice that when I summarized sentences 1 and 2, I ignored the blank and placed the but where it makes the most sense. Our brain is good at hearing contrasts, but the SAT is deliberately moving the contrast word so that our instinct isn't as effective. There are lots of ways that these connector placement questions can be put together, so you'll have to try a few different possibilities to find the correct answer. The most common trap is choice B, because that's the most common way that however is used with punctuation, so the SAT is hoping you pick it out of habit. To be clear though, answers like choice B won't always be wrong. You can't eliminate it too quickly. The best strategy on connector placement questions is to know the rules. Start by looking for complete sentences to test any strong punctuation marks. Then you can worry about which sentence needs the connector. This is one of the hardest rules on the SAT. However, I think I just made it a lot easier. Thanks for watching.